Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Tonight we journey to a place that should not exist. A place that defies everything we thought we knew about the beginning of human civilization. Imagine standing on a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey, the sun barely touching the horizon, painting the limestone ridges in shades of amber and rose. The wind moves through wild grasses, with a sound like whispered secrets from an impossible past. Before you rise massive stone pillars, carved by hands that knew no metal tools, no written language, no cities, no agriculture. They stand in perfect circles, their surfaces alive with the images of beasts, some familiar, some now extinct, all rendered with an artistic sophistication that takes your breath away. These stones were erected 11,600 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age, by people we call hunter-gatherers, by people who were not supposed to be capable of such monumental creation. This is Göbekli Tepe, the first temple on Earth, and tonight you will walk among its ancient mysteries. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. This is not just another archaeological site. What lies buried in this Turkish hillside fundamentally rewrites the story of human civilization. For generations, we believed the narrative was simple and linear. First came agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals. Agriculture created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed permanent settlements. Settlements grew into villages. Villages needed organization. Organization required religion and art and architecture. Civilization emerged from this sequence, step by careful step. Göbekli Tepe shatters this neat progression. Here the temple came first. Here hunter-gatherers with no permanent homes, no farmed fields, no domesticated animals, gathered to build something extraordinary. They carved and raised pillars weighing up to 20 tons. They created sanctuaries of stone that would not be matched in scale or sophistication for thousands of years. They did this for reasons we can only glimpse through the shadows of time, and when they were done, after generations of building and gathering and feasting and ritual, they buried it all deliberately, carefully, preserving their creation beneath tons of earth and rubble. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let go of the familiar comfort of your century. Tonight we travel back to a threshold moment in human history, to a time when our ancestors stood between two worlds, the old world of wandering and hunting, of following the herds and the seasons, and the new world of settlement and cultivation, of boundaries and ownership and permanence. Göbekli Tepe rises from this threshold, a monument to questions we are only beginning to ask. What drove these people to such extraordinary effort? What did they believe? What did they see when they gathered in these stone circles beneath the ancient stars? Let us step back through 11 millennia and discover what we can. The stones are waiting, the past is patient, and the story, though fragmentary and mysterious, is more beautiful and more strange than any fiction. Settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin our journey to the first temple on Earth. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe begins not with the distant past, but with the living memory of the 20th century. In the year 1963, a team of American archaeologists was conducting a survey of southeastern Anatolia, that vast and ancient region of modern Turkey, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers trace their paths toward the distant sea. They were documenting sites for the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul, noting everything of potential interest, cataloging the visible traces of human presence across this landscape where civilization had once been born. Among their survey points was an unremarkable artificial mound, the kind that dots this region by the thousands, each one a tell, a hill built up over centuries or millennia by successive layers of human occupation. The local Kurdish shepherds called this particular hill Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill, named for its gently rounded shape rising from the surrounding plateau. The American team noted the presence of worked flint scattered across the surface. This indicated prehistoric activity, but there was nothing to suggest anything extraordinary. They catalogued it and moved on. The hill stood silent for another 30 years, marked on maps, noted in files, but unexcavated. Sheep grazed on its slopes. The seasons turned. The wind and rain slowly eroded its surface, revealing perhaps a few more fragments of worked stone, a few more hints of what lay beneath. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived. Schmidt was experienced, scholarly, and possessed of that particular combination of intuition and persistence that defines great field archaeologists. He had studied under Harold Hauptmann and had worked extensively on Neolithic sites in this region. When he examined Göbekli Tepe, something caught his attention. The flint fragments were too numerous, too varied, and there was something else, barely visible in the weathered surface of the hill, protrusions that might be the tops of buried stones. Schmidt began to excavate. What he found in those first seasons transformed our understanding of prehistory. Just beneath the surface, sometimes only inches down, massive T-shaped limestone pillars began to emerge from the earth. They stood in circular arrangements, some still upright, others toppled, but clearly part of deliberate architectural structures. The pillars were enormous, far larger than anything expected from this time period, weighing multiple tons each. Their surfaces were not bare. They were covered with elaborate carvings, reliefs of animals rendered with startling realism and artistry. Lions prowled across the stone, foxes crept in profile, wild boars charged, snakes coiled, scorpions threatened with raised tails. Vultures spread their wings wide, and on some pillars human-like arms extended down the sides, hands meeting at what would be a figure's waist, as if the stones themselves were anthropomorphic beings, silent watchers presiding over some forgotten ceremony. Schmidt knew he had found something extraordinary, but the true shock came when the first carbon dating results arrived from the laboratory. The organic material, found in the deepest layers of the site, trapped in the floors of the stone enclosures, dated to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era. This placed the construction of Göbekli Tepe at roughly 11,600 years ago, at the very end of the Pleistocene epoch, in that transitional moment when the last ice age was releasing its grip on the planet and the climate was warming into the Holocene. This was the pre-pottery Neolithic period, specifically the pre-pottery Neolithic A time when humans in this region were still primarily hunter-gatherers. There was no evidence of agriculture here, no domesticated cereals, no domesticated animals beyond possibly the dog, no pottery, no metal tools, no wheels, no writing. And yet here stood this monumental architecture, this sophisticated art, this evidence of organized communal labor on a massive scale. The implications rippled through the archaeological community like a seismic wave. If hunter-gatherers built Göbekli Tepe, then the entire model of civilization's emergence needed revision. This was not supposed to be possible. Monumental architecture required settled populations, agricultural surpluses, complex social hierarchies, specialized labor. That was the established sequence, supported by decades of archaeological evidence from sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük. But those sites came later. Göbekli Tepe was older, much older, and it was built by mobile hunter-gatherers who should not have had the resources, the organization, or perhaps even the conceptual framework for such an undertaking. Schmidt dedicated the rest of his life to this site. He returned season after season, excavating carefully, documenting meticulously, publishing his findings, and wrestling with the profound questions that each new discovery raised. He died in 2014, but the excavation continues under new direction, and with each passing year, each new enclosure revealed, each new carving uncovered, Göbekli Tepe becomes both more understood and more mysterious. Today, if you visit the site, you will find it transformed. A modern shelter, a sweeping curved structure of wood and fabric, now protects the excavated areas from the elements. Walkways allow visitors to look down into the stone circles, to see the pillars in their original positions, to trace with their eyes the carved reliefs that still, after 11 millennia, hold a fierce and alien beauty. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage location, recognized as being of outstanding universal value to humanity. Archaeologists from multiple countries work here, employing the latest technologies, ground-penetrating radar, geophysical surveys, high-resolution photogrammetry, all in an attempt to understand what this place was, why it was built, and what it meant to the people who created it. But even with modern science, much remains unknown. Only a small percentage of the site has been excavated, perhaps 5% or less. The rest lies waiting beneath the earth, protected by the same deliberate burial that preserved it for so many thousands of years. What we have found is astonishing. What remains to be discovered is unknowable. To understand Göbekli Tepe, we must first understand the world in which it was built. Step back with me now, 11,600 years, to the late 10th millennium before the Common Era. The great ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years were in retreat. Glaciers that had stretched from the Arctic to what is now New York and London were melting, releasing their imprisoned water into the warming seas. The climate was changing dramatically, not over centuries but within the span of human lifetimes. The landscape of southeastern Anatolia, the region where Göbekli Tepe stands, was transforming. Where there had been cold steppe and tundra during the height of the last glacial period, now there was a more temperate environment emerging, a landscape of rolling hills and wide plateaus, cut by seasonal streams and rivers. This was not yet the semi-arid region we see today. The climate was significantly wetter, cooler than now but warmer than it had been. Oak woodlands spread across the hills, wild almond trees blossomed in the spring. Pistachio trees grew in dense stands. The valleys held wild wheat and barley, growing naturally in dense patches that would have been easily harvested. This was the Fertile Crescent in its original, undomesticated glory. A landscape of remarkable natural abundance. The fauna was equally rich and varied. Herds of gazelle moved across the plains in vast numbers, their migrations following the seasons and the availability of fresh grazing. Wild cattle, the massive aurochs, grazed in the valleys. Wild sheep and goats navigated the rocky hillsides. Wild boars rooted in the oak forests, feeding on acorns. Predators moved through this ecosystem in balanced numbers. Lions, now long extinct in this region, hunted the herds. Leopards prowled the forests. Wolves ran in packs. Hyenas scavenged. And in the sky, vultures wheeled on broad wings, ever watchful for death below. For humans, this landscape was paradise. The resources were abundant and diverse. The climate was moderate. Water was plentiful. The combination of wild cereals, legumes, nuts, and game animals meant that a relatively small territory could support a human population with a varied and nutritious diet. The people living here at the end of the Pleistocene were anatomically modern humans, identical to us in every biological sense. Their brains were the same size. Their cognitive capacity was identical. They had language, complex and nuanced. They had culture, rich and varied across different groups. They had art, as evidenced not just at Göbekli Tepe but in cave paintings and carved figurines found across the broader region. They had technology, sophisticated stone toolkits that had been refined and improved over thousands of generations. They had social structures, kinship systems, trading networks that connected distant groups, sharing not just goods but ideas and stories and genes. They were hunter-gatherers, but we must be careful with this term. It does not mean primitive or simple. It means a way of life adapted to living with the landscape rather than attempting to control it. Hunter-gatherer societies were mobile but not rootless. They had territories, intimate knowledge of every water source, every fruiting tree, every game trail, every useful plant within their range. They moved seasonally, following resources, but these movements were not aimless wandering. They were carefully planned circuits, returning to the same locations year after year, generation after generation. They lived in small bands, typically 20 to 50 people, extended family groups bound by kinship and mutual dependence. But these bands were not isolated. They met regularly with other bands for trade, for marriage exchanges, for shared ceremonies, for the transfer of knowledge. These gatherings were crucial, not just socially but genetically, preventing inbreeding and maintaining the health of the population. Their material culture was sophisticated but portable. They made shelters from wood and animal hides, structures that could be erected and dismantled as needed. They had clothing, likely tailored from animal skins using bone needles, sewn with sinew. They had containers, baskets woven from plant fibers, leather bags, perhaps wooden bowls. They had fire, controlled and carried with them, an ancient technology that extended back hundreds of thousands of years, essential for cooking, warmth, protection and social gathering. They had tools, primarily made from stone, especially flint, which could be knapped into razor-sharp blades, scrapers, points for spears and arrows. They had knowledge, vast and detailed, of plant properties, which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew animal behavior, tracking skills honed over lifetimes, understanding migration patterns, mating seasons, the habits of every species they hunted. The rhythm of their lives followed the seasons. Spring meant new growth, the gathering of fresh greens, the hunting of gazelle as the herds migrated through. Summer brought ripe fruits and nuts, longer days for gathering and processing food. Autumn was a time of abundance, the final harvests of wild grains, the preparation for winter. Winter required stored food, dried meat, gathered nuts, the careful husbanding of resources until the cycle began again. Life expectancy was relatively short by modern standards, perhaps 30 to 40 years on average, though individuals certainly lived much longer if they survived childhood. Infant mortality was high. Injuries from hunting or accidents could be fatal. Infections had no antibiotic cure. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests these were generally healthy populations, with diverse diets leading to strong bones and teeth, active lifestyles maintaining physical fitness, social structures providing support and care for the young, the old, and the infirm. This was the world into which Göbekli Tepe was born, a world without cities, without kings, without written records. A world where human communities were small and mobile, where survival depended on intimate knowledge of the natural world, where the boundary between the human and the sacred, between the material and the spiritual, was perhaps less rigid than it would later become. These were people fully capable of abstract thought, of artistic expression, of religious belief, of communal cooperation on scales we are only beginning to appreciate, and for reasons we do not fully understand. In this place at this time, they decided to build something that would last for ages. They chose to invest enormous labor into creating a space that was not a dwelling, not a defensive structure, not a utilitarian building for storage or processing. They built a place for gathering, for ceremony, for connecting with something beyond the daily necessities of survival. They built Göbekli Tepe. Stand now at the edge of one of the great stone circles of Göbekli Tepe. The excavation has removed the tons of earth and rubble that concealed this place for millennia, and you can see it as it appeared to its builders. The enclosure is roughly circular, though not perfectly so, measuring perhaps 15 to 20 meters across. The floor is bedrock, limestone that has been leveled and smoothed, though not polished. Around the perimeter, smaller T-shaped pillars are embedded in low stone walls, creating a boundary, a definition of sacred space. These peripheral pillars stand perhaps 2 meters tall, their surfaces mostly unadorned or bearing simple abstract carvings. But at the center of the circle, 2 much larger pillars rise toward the sky. These central monoliths are massive, standing over 5 meters tall, weighing perhaps 15 to 20 tons each. They are not crude standing stones. They are precisely shaped, carved from single blocks of limestone into that distinctive T-shape. The horizontal top resembling shoulders, the vertical shaft suggesting a body. They are, unmistakably, anthropomorphic. They are meant to represent beings, perhaps gods, perhaps ancestors, perhaps spirits of some kind that we can no longer name. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Remember, these pillars were carved and shaped using only stone tools. There was no metal at Göbekli Tepe, no bronze chisels, no iron hammers. The builders worked the limestone with flint tools, hammerstones, and grinding stones, slowly and patiently shaping these monoliths from the quarried stone. The process would have been time-consuming beyond our modern comprehension, requiring countless hours of careful work, the accumulation of skill and experience passed from one generation to the next. The T-shape is consistent across dozens of pillars found at the site, suggesting a shared symbolic language, a common understanding of what these stones represented. The horizontal top piece, the arms of the T, is slightly concave on the upper surface and convex on the lower, carved to suggest shoulders and a neck. The vertical shaft is rectangular in cross-section, its faces carefully smoothed, its edges crisp. On many of these central pillars, carved in low relief, are arms and hands. The arms extend down the sides of the shaft, bent at the elbow. The hands meet at the front, positioned at what would be waist height if this were indeed a stylized human figure. The hands are rendered with attention to detail, fingers clearly defined, sometimes holding objects, though what these objects represent is debated, perhaps belts, perhaps ritual implements. This carved gesture, the hands meeting at the center, reinforces the anthropomorphic interpretation. These are not just standing stones. They are representations of beings, perhaps watchers, perhaps participants in whatever rituals took place here. They stand facing each other across the center of the circle, these two great pillars, creating a focal point, an axis for the space. If you were to stand between them, you would feel their presence, their weight, their silent attention focused on the gathering place they define. The surface of these pillars is alive with animals. Not all pillars are equally decorated, but the finest examples display an astonishing gallery of carved creatures, rendered in profile with confident, flowing lines. Here is a lion, its body stretched in a prowling stance, its tail curved, its head turned to look directly at you with an intensity that transcends the stone. The sculptor understood anatomy, understood the musculature and proportion of the living animal, and translated that understanding into the hard limestone with remarkable skill. Beside the lion, a wild boar charges, its head lowered, its tusks prominent, a captured moment of aggression and power. Above them, a fox creeps, its bushy tail visible, its posture suggesting watchful stealth. Snakes writhe across other sections of the pillar, their scales indicated by careful patterning, their forms intertwining in complex arrangements. The vultures are particularly striking. These large birds are depicted with wings spread wide, as if descending or hovering, their featherless heads and hooked beaks rendered with precise detail. Some researchers have noted that vultures feature prominently in the iconography of Göbekli Tepe, appearing on multiple pillars, sometimes in association with human figures or what might be human remains. Vultures are carrion birds, feeders on the dead, and their presence here might be connected to beliefs about death, the afterlife, the transition of the soul, though such interpretations remain speculative. Scorpions appear as well, their segmented bodies and upraised stingers clearly identifiable, symbols perhaps of danger, of the untamed wild, of powers that command respect and caution. Birds of various species, some identifiable, others more stylized, some shown in flight, others perched. And scattered among these recognizable animals are more abstract symbols, geometric shapes, arrangements of lines and curves whose meanings are lost to us, a symbolic language we cannot read. Not all the carvings are in relief. Some are executed in 3 dimensions, fully rounded sculptures attached to the pillars. On one particularly famous pillar, a 3-dimensional reptile, possibly a Komodo dragon or a similar large lizard, crawls down the stone, its body emerging from the surface with startling realism. On another, what appears to be a human head, perhaps a skull, is carved in full 3-dimensional form, its empty eye sockets staring out across the ages. These are not decorative flourishes. These are deliberate, meaningful elements of a symbolic system that was clearly understood by the people who created and used this space. Each image, each combination of images, each placement of one animal in relation to another, likely carried specific meaning, told specific stories, invoked specific powers or concepts. We can see the artistry, we can appreciate the skill, we can recognize the animals, but we cannot, with our present knowledge, fully decode the message. The limestone from which these pillars were carved comes from quarries located on the hillside itself, not far from the excavated enclosures. Archaeologists have identified the quarry sites, places where the bedrock was cut and blocks were extracted. In one quarry, there is an unfinished pillar, still attached to the bedrock, partially carved but never completed. It lies there like a frozen moment in the construction process, showing us exactly how these monoliths were created. The builders would first trace the outline of the pillar onto the bedrock surface. Then, using stone tools, they would cut channels around the outline, gradually deepening these channels until the pillar was defined on 3 sides. The 4th side, the base, would be undercut, slowly detached from the bedrock below. Once freed, the pillar would be moved to its intended location, a feat of engineering we will explore shortly, and then the final shaping and carving would be completed. The unfinished pillar in the quarry is massive, estimated at nearly 10 meters long, potentially weighing up to 50 tons. Had it been completed and erected, it would have been the largest pillar at the site. Its abandonment raises questions. Did the project become too difficult? Did the stone develop a flaw, or did the priorities of the community shift, the need for this particular pillar no longer pressing? The enclosures themselves, the circular or oval spaces defined by these pillars, were carefully constructed. The smaller perimeter pillars were set into low stone walls, made from rough limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. These walls created a physical and symbolic boundary, separating the interior space from the exterior world. In some enclosures, benches were built into the walls, low stone seats where participants might have sat during ceremonies or gatherings. The floors were kept clean, the bedrock swept or perhaps covered with something, mats or hides, that has long since decayed. In some areas, archaeologists have found evidence of terrazzo flooring, a primitive form of polished lime plaster mixed with crushed limestone, creating a smooth, durable surface. This speaks to the care invested in these spaces, the desire to create not just functional areas but beautiful ones, worthy of their sacred purpose. Multiple enclosures have been excavated at Göbekli Tepe, each with its own unique configuration of pillars and carvings. They were not all built at once. The site was used and modified over a period of approximately 1,500 years, from roughly 9,600 to 8,200 years before the Common Era. The oldest layer, designated Layer 3 by archaeologists, contains the most impressive structures, the largest pillars, the most elaborate carvings. Over time, later builders constructed newer, smaller enclosures, sometimes reusing stones from older structures, sometimes building directly on top of earlier layers. This palimpsest of construction gives the site a complex stratigraphy, layers of meaning and activity accumulated over generations. Each generation left its mark, added its contributions, maintained and modified what their ancestors had created. And then, finally, deliberately, they buried it all, filling the enclosures with earth and rubble, entombing the stone circles beneath the artificial hill that would protect them until their rediscovery in our own time. Look closely now at the carvings that animate the surface of these ancient pillars. Each image is a window into the minds of people who lived more than 11,000 years ago. People whose thoughts and beliefs we can approach but never fully grasp. The animals depicted are not random selections from the natural world. They represent a curated collection, a deliberate choice of which creatures would be rendered in stone, elevated to permanent presence in this sacred space. The lion appears repeatedly, the apex predator of this landscape, symbol of power and danger and strength. To the people who created Göbekli Tepe, lions were real and immediate threats, animals that could kill a human with casual efficiency. Yet here they are carved with what seems almost like reverence, their bodies depicted in dynamic poses, their essential nature captured in limestone. The artistic style is distinctive and remarkably consistent across different pillars and different enclosures. The animals are shown in profile, the perspective that best captures their distinctive features. The carving is done in low relief, meaning the figures project only slightly from the background surface, but the lines are deeply incised and confident. There is no hesitation in these carvings, no tentative exploration of form. These were made by experienced artists, by people who had spent lifetimes observing these animals, understanding their movement and anatomy, and developing the technical skill to translate observation into stone. Some researchers have noted similarities to much earlier Paleolithic cave art, the paintings found in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in France, suggesting perhaps a long artistic tradition connecting these geographically distant expressions of human creativity. The wild boar, another frequent subject, would have been both prey and threat. Boars are aggressive when threatened, their tusks capable of inflicting terrible wounds. They are also intelligent and adaptable, characteristics that might have inspired respect. To hunt a boar successfully required courage and skill. To carve one on a sacred pillar might have been a way of acknowledging its power, its place in the order of things, its role in the life and death cycles that sustained human communities. The fox, smaller and less dangerous, appears as well, perhaps representing cunning and adaptability, qualities valued in a world where survival often depended on quick thinking and resourcefulness. The snakes, rendered in various species including what appears to be vipers, are symbols with deep resonance in many human cultures, associated with transformation, danger, healing, the earth itself. The prevalence of vultures in the iconography of Göbekli Tepe is particularly intriguing. Vultures are not typically depicted as beautiful or noble creatures. They feed on death. They circle above dying animals, waiting with patient hunger for life to end. Yet at Göbekli Tepe, they are given prominent placement. Their wings spread wide in poses that could be read as protective or threatening or simply observant. One pillar, known as the vulture stone, shows what appears to be a headless human figure surrounded by vultures, an image that has sparked intense debate among archaeologists. Some interpret this as depicting excarnation, the practice of allowing vultures and other scavengers to strip flesh from human corpses as part of burial customs, a practice known from other Neolithic cultures in the region. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that the people of Göbekli Tepe had complex funerary beliefs, viewing death not as an end but as a transformation, with vultures serving as psychopomps, carriers of the dead from one realm to another. Other carvings are less immediately interpretable. There are abstract symbols, geometric patterns, arrangements of cups and channels carved into the stone, H-shaped symbols, crescent shapes, radial patterns that might represent celestial bodies or might mean something entirely different. Some pillars have what appear to be three-dimensional pouches or bags carved near the top, hanging from invisible belts. What did these pouches contain? Were they ritual objects, offerings, symbols of abundance or protection? We have no texts to guide us. The people who made these carvings left no written explanation of their meaning. We are left to interpret based on context, comparison with other sites, and cautious speculation grounded in what we know of human symbolic thinking generally. The anthropomorphic nature of the central pillars, the suggestion that they represent beings of some kind, opens another layer of interpretation. If these pillars are meant to be persons or spirits or gods, then the animals carved upon them might be attributes or associations or stories told about these beings. In some cultures, individuals have animal totems, spiritual connections to particular species that define identity or role within the community. Perhaps each pillar represents a different lineage, a different ancestor, a different aspect of the sacred, identified by the animals that adorn it. The two central pillars in each enclosure, facing each other, might represent a fundamental duality, opposites in balance, male and female, life and death, earth and sky, concepts that appear in the mythologies of many cultures. The hands carved on the pillars, those human hands meeting at the waist, are particularly evocative. They are rendered with enough detail that we can see fingers, knuckles, sometimes what might be bracelets or bindings around the wrists. They are active hands, hands that hold and grasp, hands that perform actions. What did these hands once hold in the minds of the viewers? Were the pillars meant to be guardians, protectors of this space, their hands positioned in gestures of authority or blessing or warning? Or were they participants, figures engaged in some ritual dance or ceremony frozen in stone, their hands positioned in meaningful mudras whose significance we can no longer decode? What is particularly striking is the absence of certain subjects. There are no domestic animals at Göbekli Tepe, because domestic animals did not yet exist in this time and place. There are no grain fields, no plows, no symbols of agriculture. There are remarkably few depictions of humans. The focus is overwhelmingly on wild animals, on the fauna of the untamed landscape. This tells us something important about the worldview of the builders. They lived in a world where humans were not yet dominant, not yet the transformers of the landscape. They were participants in a larger community of beings, sharing the land with powerful and often dangerous others. The animals carved at Göbekli Tepe were neighbors in the truest sense, creatures whose lives intersected with human lives daily, whose presence defined the rhythms and risks of existence. The placement of carvings on the pillars is not random. Some animals are positioned near the top, others lower down. Some face right, others left. Some are grouped together, others isolated. These arrangements likely carried meaning, created visual narratives or symbolic associations that would have been immediately readable to the people who used this space. Modern visitors can see the beauty of individual carvings, can appreciate the technical skill of the sculptors, but we cannot read the pillars as texts. We are like illiterate people standing before a library, able to admire the bindings but unable to access the stories within. Yet even in this state of partial understanding, the impact is profound. These carvings speak to us across the millennia of human consciousness, of abstract thought, of the need to make meaning, to create beauty, to connect with something beyond the immediate material world. And we must remember that what we see today is only a fraction of what once was. The pillars originally stood upright. Many still do, but their full context included elements that have not survived. Were there wooden structures, roofs or canopies over the enclosures, fabric banners or hangings, painted decorations, pigments applied to the stone that have weathered away, music and song and spoken prayers, fire pits where offerings were burned? The stone endures, but so much has been lost. The perishable elements of ritual and ceremony that would have filled this space with life and meaning. We see the bones of Göbekli Tepe, the durable skeleton of stone, but the flesh, the living practice, the full sensory experience of being here during a ceremony 11,000 years ago, that remains tantalizingly out of reach. a ghost presence we can sense but not fully see. Now step away from the finished monument and imagine the process of its creation. Imagine yourself not as a modern observer, but as a member of one of the communities that built Göbekli Tepe. Your life is that of a hunter-gatherer, your existence shaped by the rhythms of the natural world. You live in a band of perhaps 30 people, extended family, moving seasonally across a territory you know with intimate detail. You know where the gazelle herds will appear in spring, where the wild wheat ripens in early summer, where the nut trees can be harvested in autumn. Your material possessions are limited to what can be carried. Your shelter is temporary, erected at each camp and disassembled when the band moves on. Your diet is varied and generally nutritious, though feast and famine follow the seasons. Your clothing is animal skin, carefully prepared and sewn. Your tools are stone and wood and bone. Your nights are spent around fires, telling stories, maintaining relationships, teaching children the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. And yet, you are also part of something larger, something that transcends your immediate band. Several times a year, perhaps at specific points in the seasonal cycle, your band joins with others, coming together at a predetermined location. These gatherings are essential. They are times for trading goods, for arranging marriages, for sharing information about resources and dangers, for maintaining the social bonds that connect separate bands into a larger cultural community. And at these gatherings you also engage in ritual, in ceremony, in the performance of actions that connect you to the sacred, to the ancestors, to the powers that govern the world. It is at one of these gathering places, Göbekli Tepe, that something extraordinary happens. The decision is made, through processes we cannot fully understand, to create something permanent, something that will endure beyond a single season, beyond a single lifetime. The project begins in the quarry. Men select a suitable section of limestone bedrock, free from cracks or major flaws, using hammerstones made of harder stone, perhaps basalt. They begin to pound at the rock, creating channels around the outline of the pillar. The work is slow and physically demanding. Each strike of the hammerstone chips away a tiny fragment of limestone. The channels must be deep enough to free the pillar from the bedrock around it, perhaps 30 or 40 centimeters deep along each side. This requires thousands of hammer strikes, coordinated effort, the accumulation of incremental progress over days or weeks. The workers rotate, their hands blistering, their backs aching, but the work continues. The channel gradually deepens. The pillar begins to emerge as a distinct object, though still attached at its base to the living rock beneath. Once the side channels are complete, the most difficult work begins. The base of the pillar must be undercut, slowly detached from below using the same hammering technique, working in cramped conditions, reaching under the pillar to strike at the connection point. There is always a risk at this stage that the stone will crack, that some hidden flaw will reveal itself under the stress, that weeks of labor will be wasted. But finally, with careful work and perhaps ritual precautions, offerings to ensure success, the pillar is freed. It lies now in the quarry, a massive rough stone, 10 or 15 or 20 tons of limestone, its general T-shape defined but its surface still rough, waiting to be moved and finished. The unfinished pillar still visible in the quarry at Göbekli Tepe gives us a direct glimpse into this stage of the process, frozen in time, never completed, for reasons we will never know. Moving the pillar from the quarry to its intended location is an engineering challenge of the first order. These people had no wheels, no metal tools, no draft animals. They had human muscle, wooden levers, rope made from plant fibers or animal sinew, and accumulated practical knowledge of leverage and friction. The distance from the quarry to the enclosures is not great, perhaps 100 meters, but the slope is uneven and the weight is immense. The most likely method involves rolling the pillar on wooden rollers, cylindrical logs laid in parallel across the path. Teams of men, perhaps dozens, would use ropes to pull the pillar, while others would constantly move rollers from the back to the front, maintaining a rolling platform beneath the moving stone. Wooden levers would be used to lift and shift the pillar, to make small adjustments to its position and direction. This work requires organization and coordination. Someone must direct the effort, ensuring that the teams pull in unison, that the rollers are positioned correctly, that the path ahead is cleared of obstacles. The work would be accompanied by rhythm, perhaps chanting or singing, to coordinate the pulls, to maintain morale, to make the labor bearable through shared sound. It would take many people working together, far more people than any single band could provide. This means that the construction of Göbekli Tepe necessarily involved multiple communities cooperating, contributing labor, bringing their people together for this shared purpose. This is itself significant. These were not people living in a permanent village with a resident population that could be directed by a central authority. These were mobile groups coming together voluntarily, contributing effort to a project that would benefit all but belong to none exclusively. Once the pillar reaches its designated location, it must be erected, lifted from horizontal to vertical, and set into a prepared socket carved into the bedrock floor. This is perhaps the most dangerous moment in the entire process. The pillar must be tipped up, its base aligned with the socket, then carefully lowered into place. This requires precise control over the descent, preventing the pillar from crashing down with force that could break it or damage the socket. The technique likely involved creating a ramp of earth, rolling or sliding the pillar up the ramp until one end extended over the prepared socket. Then, using ropes and levers, teams would carefully lift the overhanging end while others guided the base into position. As the pillar tipped toward vertical, the weight would shift, becoming increasingly difficult to control. At the critical moment, when the pillar's center of gravity passed the tipping point, it would need to be lowered carefully, perhaps using counterweights or by slowly releasing tension on restraining ropes, until it settled into its socket with a final, irreversible commitment to position. Once erected, the pillar would be secured, the socket packed with smaller stones and earth to hold the base firmly in place. Then the final shaping and carving would begin. Scaffolding made from wood would be erected around the pillar, allowing the carvers access to all parts of the surface. Using flint tools, carefully shaped flint blades and gravers, the artists would sketch the outlines of their designs, then gradually carve away the background stone, creating the raised reliefs. This work is meticulous and time-consuming, requiring steady hands and acute visual judgment. A mistake cannot easily be corrected. The limestone is relatively soft as stones go, which makes carving possible, but also means that an errant stroke can ruin a developing image. The finest carvings at Göbekli Tepe show no evidence of such mistakes. The lines are confident and clean, suggesting artists working at the peak of their ability, perhaps after years of practice on smaller stones, on portable objects, on any surface that would allow them to develop and refine their technique. The entire process, from quarrying to erection to final carving, would require months or even years for a single pillar. Multiply this by the dozens of pillars at the site, add the construction of the enclosure walls, the preparation of the floors, the creation of benches and other features, and the total labor investment becomes staggering. Estimates vary, but some archaeologists have suggested that building Göbekli Tepe might have required tens of thousands of person-hours of labor. This labor was not extracted through coercion. There were no kings at Göbekli Tepe, no warrior elite forcing peasants to work. This was voluntary cooperation, communities coming together to create something they collectively valued, investing their time and energy because the result was worth the cost. This speaks to powerful motivations, to beliefs and values so compelling that people would dedicate substantial portions of their lives to this project. We can imagine the work as being seasonal. During the abundant months when food was plentiful and the weather favorable, larger groups could gather at Göbekli Tepe. They would camp nearby, perhaps in temporary structures surrounding the hilltop. The days would be filled with labor, teams working the quarry, others moving stones, others carving, others managing the camp, preparing food, maintaining tools. The evenings would be for gathering, for feasting on the game hunted in the surrounding landscape, for sharing news and stories, for the rituals and ceremonies that were presumably the ultimate purpose of all this effort. Then, as the season changed, as resources in this immediate area were depleted, the gathering would disperse, the various bands returning to their respective territories, resuming their normal seasonal rounds. But the work at Göbekli Tepe would remain, waiting for the next gathering, the next season of construction and ceremony. Progress would be incremental, each season adding to what previous seasons had created, a long-term project spanning multiple generations, each cohort building on the foundation laid by their predecessors, contributing to something that transcended any individual lifetime. This intergenerational aspect is crucial to understanding Göbekli Tepe. This was not a structure built in a few years and then abandoned. It was maintained and modified over approximately 1,500 years. Families brought their children to the gatherings. Those children learned the stories, the rituals, the meanings associated with this place. They watched their parents work the stone, and when they grew to adulthood, they took up the work themselves, teaching their own children in turn. The site was a living tradition, passed from generation to generation, adapting and evolving but maintaining its essential character and purpose. This continuity of use and meaning over such a long span of time suggests that Göbekli Tepe was profoundly important to the communities that created and maintained it, a cornerstone of their cultural and spiritual identity, a place that defined who they were and how they understood their place in the cosmos. Return now to the technical marvel of these pillars, to the engineering knowledge embedded in their creation. The quarrying process itself reveals sophisticated understanding of stone properties and fracture mechanics. The workers at Göbekli Tepe knew how to read the stone, to identify the planes along which limestone could be most easily split, to recognize and avoid flaws that would compromise structural integrity. Modern stonemasons, examining the quarry sites, have expressed admiration for the precision of the work, the efficiency of the extraction technique. These were not people randomly hacking at rock. They had developed over generations a refined methodology for liberating large blocks from the bedrock with minimal waste and maximum safety. The choice of limestone was itself significant. Limestone is sedimentary rock, formed from the compressed remains of ancient marine organisms layered over millions of years. It is relatively soft compared to granite or basalt, which makes it workable with stone tools but still durable enough to withstand millennia of exposure to the elements. The limestone at Göbekli Tepe has a fine, relatively uniform texture, ideal for carving detailed reliefs. The T-shaped form of the pillars is not arbitrary. This shape is inherently stable when set vertically. The wide top provides resistance to tipping, while the narrower shaft concentrates weight directly over the base, minimizing the risk of lateral failure. Whether this stability was understood intuitively or through trial and error, it represents practical engineering knowledge successfully applied. The sockets carved into the bedrock floor to receive the pillar bases are another engineering detail worth noting. These sockets are not simple holes. They are carefully shaped to match the contours of the pillar base, providing a stable seating that distributes weight evenly and prevents the pillar from shifting or rotating once erected. In some cases, the sockets are deeper on one side, creating a slight tilt to the finished pillar. Whether this tilt was intentional, perhaps for aesthetic or symbolic reasons, or represents a miscalculation, we cannot say. But the overall precision of the socket placement, the accurate spacing between the two central pillars in each enclosure, suggests careful planning and measurement, the use of some system, perhaps counting paces or using cord of standardized lengths, to ensure that the finished structure would conform to the intended design. The construction sequence reveals further sophistication. The evidence suggests that at least some of the perimeter wall construction occurred simultaneously with or even before the erection of the central pillars. This would provide a framework, a defined space within which the main pillars could be positioned. The builders were not simply placing stones randomly, they were working to a plan, a conceptual design that existed first in minds and perhaps in small-scale models or drawings that have not survived before being translated into monumental stone reality. This capacity for abstract planning, for visualizing a finished structure and then organizing the steps necessary to realize that vision, is a hallmark of advanced cognitive capability, the same mental processes that allow modern architects to work from blueprints. The coordination of labor represents another level of organizational complexity. Archaeological evidence from the site includes vast quantities of animal bones, primarily from wild cattle and gazelle, found in the areas surrounding the enclosures. These bones represent feasting, large-scale communal meals that would have accompanied the gathering and construction events. Feeding hundreds of people, perhaps more, requires planning and management. Someone or some group must have been responsible for organizing the hunt, for processing and preparing the meat, for distributing food fairly among the gathered communities. This does not necessarily imply formal hierarchy or institutionalized authority, but it does require effective leadership and cooperation, the ability to make collective decisions and ensure their implementation. The flint tools used for carving and cutting were themselves products of skilled manufacture. Flint knapping, the art of shaping stone by striking it in controlled ways to produce sharp edges, is a technology that requires substantial knowledge and practice. A skilled knapper can read the internal structure of a piece of flint, anticipate how it will fracture, and produce blades of remarkable sharpness and uniformity. The flint used at Göbekli Tepe was not locally sourced. It was brought from quarries some distance away, indicating trade networks, the movement of valuable materials across the landscape. Some of the finest flint blades found at the site are so well made that they may have been produced by specialist knappers, individuals who had devoted years to perfecting this craft, whose products were valued and sought after across the region. The woodworking implied by the construction process is another largely invisible skill set. The rollers for moving pillars, the levers for lifting and positioning, the scaffolding for reaching high surfaces to carve, all would have required careful selection and shaping of wood. Different tree species have different properties. Oak is strong and dense, pine is lighter and easier to work. The builders would have needed to understand these properties, to choose appropriate wood for each task, to cut and shape it using stone axes and fire, techniques of steaming and bending to create curved elements. None of this wood survives at Göbekli Tepe. The climate is too dry, the passage of time too long. But the evidence of its use is implicit in the successful completion of engineering tasks that could not have been accomplished without it. Rope making is another essential technology that has left little direct trace. Moving multi-ton pillars requires strong rope, capable of withstanding tremendous tension without breaking. Natural fibers, whether plant-based like flax or animal-based like sinew, must be processed and twisted together to create strong cord. This is skilled work, time-consuming and requiring knowledge of fiber properties and rope construction techniques. The ropes used at Göbekli Tepe might have been substantial in thickness, woven from multiple strands capable of bearing loads measured in tons. Their creation would have been a project in itself, one of many supporting tasks necessary to make the main construction possible. The maintenance of tools is yet another dimension of the technical knowledge required. Stone tools, even well-made ones, dull and chip with use. They must be constantly resharpened or replaced. This means that flint knapping was not a one-time preparation activity, but an ongoing process throughout the construction. There would have been designated areas, workshops perhaps, where skilled knappers worked continuously to produce and maintain the supply of usable tools. The debitage, the waste flakes produced by flint knapping, accumulates rapidly. Large amounts of this material have been found at Göbekli Tepe, concentrated in certain areas, suggesting organized tool production and maintenance facilities. Water management might also have been a concern. Carving limestone produces dust. Moistening the stone surface makes carving easier and produces cleaner lines. Water would have been needed for other purposes as well, drinking for the workforce, preparation of food, perhaps ritual ablutions. The nearest permanent water source is some distance from the hilltop. Carrying water up the slope in leather bags or baskets would have been another daily labor, one of those essential but unglamorous tasks that make larger projects possible. The organization of these support activities, ensuring that carvers had water when needed, that workers had food at appropriate intervals, that tools were available and maintained. All of this required coordination and planning, the smooth functioning of a complex temporary community organized around a shared purpose. The scale of Göbekli Tepe also raises questions about numbers. How many people were required for each phase of construction? Moving a 20-ton pillar probably required at least 50 to 100 people pulling on ropes, plus others managing the rollers and providing directional control. Erecting the pillar would require similar or greater numbers, if multiple enclosures were under construction simultaneously, which seems likely given the 1500-year span of the site's use. Then the peak gatherings might have involved several hundred people, a significant concentration for a hunter-gatherer society. Such concentrations could not be sustained year-round. The local resources would be quickly depleted. But for short periods, weeks or months, such gatherings would be possible, especially if planned to coincide with peak resource availability, the gazelle migrations, the ripening of wild cereals, times when food could be obtained in abundance with relatively less effort. These large gatherings would have served multiple purposes beyond construction. They were economic events. Opportunities for trade, exchange of goods, flint and obsidian, ochre for pigments, shells from the distant Mediterranean coast, exotic materials that enhanced life and carried prestige. They were social events, times for young people to meet potential mates from other bands, essential for maintaining genetic health of the population and for creating kinship networks that connected distant groups. They were political events in a broad sense, times for negotiating access to resources, for resolving disputes, for affirming alliances, and they were profoundly religious events, times for ritual and ceremony, for connecting with ancestors and spirits and the sacred powers that governed the world. Göbekli Tepe was the physical manifestation, the enduring stage, for all these aspects of human social and spiritual life. The stones were the permanent element, but the gatherings, the living human presence, were what gave them meaning and purpose. What was the purpose of Göbekli Tepe? Why did these hunter-gatherer communities invest such enormous effort into creating this monument? These questions have no definitive answers, but we can approach them through careful consideration of the evidence and thoughtful comparison with other cultures, both ancient and more recent. The lack of domestic structures at the site is significant. Göbekli Tepe was not a village. No houses have been found. No hearths for daily cooking. No storage facilities for provisions. No middens showing the accumulated debris of long-term residential occupation. The architecture is explicitly ceremonial. Spaces designed for gathering and ritual, not for living. This means people came to Göbekli Tepe for specific purposes, and then departed, returning to their normal seasonal rounds. The evidence of feasting is one of the clearest indicators of the site's function. The animal bones found at Göbekli Tepe represent thousands of individual animals, predominantly wild cattle and gazelle, butchered and consumed on or near the site. The quantity of remains suggests not ordinary meals but communal feasts, large-scale consumption events where many people ate together. Feasting is a universal human practice with deep social and ritual significance. It is not simply about satisfying hunger. It is about creating and reinforcing social bonds, about demonstrating generosity and abundance, about marking important occasions, about participating in something larger than oneself. At Göbekli Tepe, the feasting would have been inseparable from the ritual and ceremonial activities, the gathering itself being a celebration, a demonstration of the community's vitality and prosperity. The carved pillars suggest that Göbekli Tepe was a sacred space, a place where the boundary between the ordinary and the numinous was thin, where humans could approach or commune with powers beyond the everyday world. The anthropomorphic pillars, with their human hands and their galleries of carved animals, might represent ancestors or spirits or gods. The very act of entering the enclosure, of standing among these monumental beings, would have been a profound experience, a sensory and psychological immersion into sacred space. The circular form of the enclosures is itself suggestive. Circles have no beginning or end. They are symbols of completeness, eternity, cycles. Many religious architectures across cultures have used circular forms for sacred spaces, from the medicine wheels of Native American traditions to the round churches of medieval Europe. The circle creates a sense of enclosure, of protection, of unity among those within. Some researchers have explored possible astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe. The orientation of certain pillars and enclosures shows some correlation with celestial events, particularly the positions of stars and constellations as they would have appeared 11,000 years ago. The precession of the Earth's axis means that the night sky looked different then, with different stars marking the celestial poles, different patterns visible at different times of year. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were encoding astronomical knowledge into their structures, this would suggest sophisticated observation of the heavens and a belief system that connected earthly activities with celestial patterns. However, these alignments remain debated, with some archaeologists urging caution about reading too much astronomical significance into what might be coincidental orientations or later interpretations imposed by modern observers eager to find patterns. The hypothesis that has gained perhaps the most traction in recent years is that Göbekli Tepe was a regional center for a widespread cultural or religious tradition, a place where multiple distinct hunter-gatherer bands came together periodically to participate in shared rituals and to reinforce their collective identity. In this view, Göbekli Tepe served a function similar to later pilgrimage centers, places that people traveled to in order to participate in ceremonies, to make offerings, to connect with the sacred, and to reaffirm their place within a larger cultural and spiritual community. The monumental architecture would have served as a focal point, a stage for ritual performances, and a material demonstration of the community's values and beliefs. The question of what specific rituals took place at Göbekli Tepe is impossible to answer with certainty. We can only speculate, based on practices known from other cultures. There might have been initiations, ceremonies marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, tests of courage or skill conducted in the presence of the sacred pillars and witnessed by representatives of multiple communities. There might have been seasonal celebrations, ceremonies marking the solstices or equinoxes, the beginning of the hunting season, the time of the gazelle migrations. There might have been funerary rites, though very few human remains have been found at the site, suggesting that if death rituals occurred here, they did not involve burying bodies within the enclosures themselves. The presence of vultures in the iconography might support the theory of excarnation practices. In cultures that practice excarnation, the body of the deceased is exposed on platforms or in special locations where scavengers can strip the flesh, leaving only bones. These bones are then collected and may be buried or placed in ossuaries or used in various ritual contexts. This practice is not morbid in the cultures that employ it. It is understood as a necessary transformation, a way of releasing the spirit from the flesh, of returning the material body to the cycle of nature while preserving the essential elements, the bones that might contain the essence or memory of the person. If such practices occurred at Göbekli Tepe, the vultures carved on the pillars would be more than decorative. They would be essential participants in the sacred drama of death and transformation. The animals depicted on the pillars might also have served as totems or symbols associated with different clans or lineages within the larger community. In many hunter-gatherer societies, descent groups identify themselves with particular animals, seeing themselves as related to or protected by these species. If each pillar or each enclosure was associated with a different group, then the gathering at Göbekli Tepe would bring together representatives of all these groups, creating a physical and ritual unity from social diversity. The feasting would then be not just communal eating but an expression of this unity, different groups contributing to and partaking from a shared abundance, enacting their interconnection through the most basic human activity of sharing food. Music and dance almost certainly played a role in the ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe. Music is universal in human cultures, and archaeological evidence of musical instruments extends far back into prehistory. Flutes made from bird bones, drums made from animal hides stretched over wooden frames, rattles made from gourds or shells filled with seeds, all would have been easily producible with the technology available to the builders of Göbekli Tepe. The enclosures themselves, with their stone walls, would have created interesting acoustic spaces, perhaps amplifying or resonating certain frequencies. Dancing, the rhythmic movement of bodies in coordinated patterns, is another universal ritual practice, a way of embodying belief, of creating unity through synchronized action, of inducing altered states of consciousness through repetition and exertion. To imagine the ceremonies at Göbekli Tepe without music and dance would be to ignore essential dimensions of how humans create and maintain religious experience. Fire would have been present certainly for practical purposes of light and warmth during evening and nighttime gatherings, but also likely for ritual purposes. Fire is transformative. It turns raw food into cooked, cold into warm, darkness into light. It can be dangerous, capable of destroying, but also purifying. Many religious traditions incorporate fire into their rituals, from the sacrificial fires of ancient Indo-European religions to the eternal flames maintained in temples. At Göbekli Tepe, fires might have burned in the centers of the enclosures, their smoke rising toward the sky, their light animating the carved stone figures, creating flickering shadows that made the pillars seem almost alive, transforming the space into something beyond the ordinary, outside normal time and experience. The deliberate burial of the site, which we will explore more fully in a later section, itself suggests that Göbekli Tepe's religious function was paramount. When the site was finally abandoned, it was not simply left to decay. It was carefully, systematically filled in with earth and rubble, preserving the structures beneath. This was not destruction. It was preservation, perhaps even consecration. The act of burial might have been a final ritual, a way of closing a chapter, of honoring what this place had meant, of ensuring that even though active use was ending, the sacred nature of the site would remain, locked beneath the earth, waiting, as it turned out, for a distant future when humans with very different tools and knowledge would uncover it again and stand in wonder before what their ancient ancestors had created. Göbekli Tepe sits at a crucial moment in human history, a threshold between two worlds, two ways of being human. To understand its full significance, we must place it in the context of the broader transformation occurring across the Fertile Crescent in the millennia following its construction. This transformation is known as the Neolithic Revolution, though revolution is perhaps too dramatic a word for a process that unfolded over thousands of years. It might be better called the Neolithic Transition, the slow, complex, geographically variable shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture and animal domestication, from mobile to sedentary life, from small egalitarian bands to larger hierarchical settlements. When Göbekli Tepe was being built, around 9600 to 8200 years before the Common Era, this transition was just beginning. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew naturally in the region, and people had long harvested them. But cultivation, the deliberate planting of seeds in prepared ground, the tending of crops, the selective breeding that would gradually transform wild plants into domesticated varieties optimized for human use. These practices were in their earliest experimental stages. Similarly, people had long hunted wild sheep and goats and cattle, but the capture and breeding of animals, the gradual process of domestication that would create lineages genetically and behaviorally distinct from their wild ancestors, adapted to living in close association with humans, this was only beginning. The traditional narrative held that agriculture came first, driven perhaps by environmental pressure, population growth, or climate change that made mobile hunting and gathering less viable. Agriculture created food surpluses, which allowed some people to specialize in non-food producing activities. Permanent settlements grew around agricultural fields. Social complexity increased. Religion and monumental architecture emerged as expressions of this new settled complexity. Göbekli Tepe challenges this sequence fundamentally. Here was monumental architecture and complex ceremonial life among hunter-gatherers, before agriculture, before permanent settlement. This has led some researchers to propose a radical reversal of the traditional narrative. Perhaps religion came first. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe and similar sites represent the initial spark, the gathering of people for ritual purposes that eventually necessitated more reliable food sources to feed the larger and more frequent assemblies, which in turn drove the experimentation with cultivation and domestication. Klaus Schmidt, the original excavator of Göbekli Tepe, famously suggested that religion motivated the Neolithic Revolution, that the temple came before the village. In this view, the regular gathering of people at sites like Göbekli Tepe would have put pressure on wild resources in the surrounding area. The need to feed hundreds of people repeatedly in the same location would have encouraged efforts to increase food availability, either by protecting and encouraging the growth of desired plants, or by attempting to keep preferred animals nearby, rather than having to track and hunt them across the landscape. Over time, these pragmatic efforts would have led to the genetic and behavioral changes we recognize as domestication. The people involved might not have conceived of what they were doing as inventing agriculture. They were simply solving practical problems, adapting their practices to meet the needs created by their religious commitments. This hypothesis remains controversial but intriguing. What is clear is that the region around Göbekli Tepe saw some of the earliest evidence of plant cultivation and animal domestication anywhere in the world. Within a few centuries of Göbekli Tepe's initial construction, sites in the surrounding area show signs of cultivation. By the time Göbekli Tepe was buried, around 8200 years before the Common Era, agriculture was well established in the region, and permanent villages were becoming common. The site itself shows no evidence of agriculture during its period of active use, but it cannot have been isolated from these broader transformations occurring in the surrounding landscape. The cognitive and social changes implied by the Neolithic transition were profound. Agriculture requires a different relationship with time and place. Hunter-gatherers think in terms of seasonal movements, of going to where resources are available. Farmers think in terms of annual cycles, of planting and harvest, of investing labor now for returns months in the future. This requires patience, planning, and a more settled relationship with specific locations. The land where one plants becomes one's land in a way that hunting territories, used but not transformed, never quite do. This shift in relationship with landscape, from using what nature provides to actively shaping nature to increase production, is fundamental. It brings with it new concepts of ownership, inheritance, boundaries. Agriculture also changes social relationships. Stored grain can be stolen, which necessitates defense. Permanent settlements can be raided, requiring fortifications. Surplus production allows some individuals to accumulate more than others, creating wealth differentials that can become entrenched and transmitted across generations. The egalitarian ethos of most hunter-gatherer societies, where status is achieved through skill and generosity rather than inherited, begins to give way to more hierarchical structures. Chiefs emerge, then kings. Specialized roles develop: potters, weavers, metalworkers, priests. Writing is eventually invented to track ownership and transactions. Cities grow. Civilization in the conventional sense emerges, but all of this comes later, centuries and millennia after Göbekli Tepe. What Göbekli Tepe represents is the cusp, the threshold moment when humans still lived primarily as hunter-gatherers, but were beginning to envision and create something new. The monumental architecture itself is forward-looking, an investment in permanence unusual for mobile peoples. The gathering of multiple communities for shared ritual purposes creates the social density and complexity that will later characterize settled life. The possible role of the site in encouraging agricultural experimentation, if the hypothesis is correct, makes it literally a birthplace of civilization, the place where the chain of events was set in motion that would lead to cities and states and empires. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe has yielded other important Neolithic sites that help contextualize its significance. Nivali Chori, a settlement located about 40 kilometers away, shows similar architectural traditions and carved pillars, though on a smaller scale and from a slightly later period. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not unique but part of a broader regional tradition, a shared symbolic language and architectural practice spread across southeastern Anatolia. Other sites in the region, both earlier and contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, show increasing social complexity, more investment in structures, more elaborate symbolic artifacts. Göbekli Tepe is the most spectacular example discovered so far, but it sits within a network of sites that collectively document this crucial transitional period. The question of cause and effect remains difficult to untangle. Did the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe drive agricultural development, or did early agricultural success enable the labor investment required for such monuments? Probably the relationship was more complex than simple linear causation. Different processes would have reinforced each other in feedback loops. More reliable food sources allowed larger gatherings. Larger gatherings increased the status and prestige of groups that could host them, encouraging further efforts to secure abundant food. Ritual and economic and social motivations would have intertwined, each influencing the others in ways that made the overall trajectory towards settled agricultural life increasingly probable, though never inevitable. What we can say with confidence is that Göbekli Tepe documents a moment when humans were actively creating new possibilities, experimenting with new ways of organizing themselves, new relationships with the landscape, new expressions of belief and identity. The people who built these stone circles were neither primitive nor simple. They were innovators, artists, engineers, visionaries who saw possibilities and worked to realize them. They stood between worlds, still carrying much of the hunter-gatherer ethos, the mobility, the egalitarian social structures, the intimate knowledge of wild plants and animals, but also reaching towards something new, the permanence of stone, the complexity of large-scale cooperation, the symbolic elaboration that would later characterize religious architecture everywhere. They were our ancestors, and Göbekli Tepe is their gift to us, a message across time that speaks of human capacity for wonder, creativity, and the urge to build something that endures. After approximately 1,500 years of use, Göbekli Tepe was abandoned. But abandoned is not quite the right word. The site was not simply left to slowly decay under the assault of weather and time. Instead, it was deliberately buried, filled in with earth and rubble in a careful, systematic process that preserved the structures beneath. This burial is one of the most intriguing aspects of Göbekli Tepe, raising profound questions about why a site that had clearly been so important for so long would be intentionally covered over and left. The process of burial was methodical. The enclosures were filled with a mixture of soil, broken limestone fragments, and occasional artifacts, flint tools, animal bones, stone vessels. This was not random dumping of refuse. The fill was placed carefully, layered deposits that suggest controlled deposition over time. In some cases, smaller stones and broken pillars from earlier structures were incorporated into the fill, recycled, perhaps from older enclosures that had been deliberately dismantled. The act of burial protected the carved pillars from further weathering, creating the conditions that would preserve them for millennia until modern excavation. The backfilled enclosures created the characteristic mounded form of the hill, the gentle pot-belly shape that gave the site its Turkish name. Why would the builders and users of Göbekli Tepe have invested effort in this deliberate burial? Several theories have been proposed, though none can be proven with certainty. One possibility is that the burial was a ritual act, a final ceremony that sanctified the site and marked the end of its active use. In this view, the burial was not rejection or abandonment but consecration, a way of closing a sacred chapter, of honoring what the site had meant by ensuring it would be preserved in a different form, hidden but not destroyed, waiting beneath the earth. The care taken in the burial process supports this interpretation. This was not hasty concealment but deliberate preservation. Another theory connects the burial to the broader changes occurring in society during this period. As agriculture became established and people settled into permanent villages, the old patterns of seasonal gathering at regional centers might have lost relevance or meaning. The values and practices of agricultural societies differ from those of hunter-gatherers. Farmers are tied to specific plots of land, their labor and identity invested in cultivated fields. The mobility and wide-ranging social networks of hunter-gatherers give way to more localized community structures, villages whose inhabitants share not just ceremony but daily life, work and residence. In this context, a regional ceremonial center like Göbekli Tepe might have seemed increasingly anachronistic, a relic of an older way of life that no longer resonated with contemporary priorities. The shift from communal to household-based religious practice might also have played a role. As people settled into permanent homes, domestic rituals and household shrines became more important. The large-scale communal gatherings that Göbekli Tepe facilitated might have been replaced by more localized village-level ceremonies. The monumental architecture that once served to unite scattered bands might have become unnecessary or even problematic, representing obligations and traditions that conflicted with new social structures and new priorities. Rather than simply neglect the site, allowing it to fall into ruin, the decision might have been made to formally close it, to acknowledge the end of an era while preserving the physical legacy of what had been. Some researchers have suggested more practical explanations. Perhaps the effort required to maintain the site and organize the gatherings became too burdensome. Perhaps conflicts arose between different groups over control or access, making the site a source of tension rather than unity. Perhaps environmental changes, shifts in game animal populations or the availability of wild plant resources, made the location less suitable for large gatherings. Any or all of these factors might have contributed to the decision to cease active use. The fact that the burial occurred gradually, over a period of time rather than in a single event, suggests that different enclosures might have been closed at different times. This fits with the archaeological evidence showing that the site was built and modified over many generations. Perhaps each enclosure had its own lifespan, active for a certain period before being ritually closed and buried, with newer enclosures being constructed nearby to continue the tradition. Eventually, all the enclosures were buried, and the site as a whole ceased to function as an active ceremonial center, but the knowledge of what lay beneath was perhaps not entirely forgotten. Local traditions might have preserved some memory of the site's significance, vague stories of a sacred hill where the ancestors had gathered in the distant past. The materials used to fill the enclosures provide some information about the burial process. The broken limestone pieces were quarried nearby, perhaps from the same sources that provided stone for the original construction. The soil is typical of the local area. The artifacts included in the fill are mostly utilitarian, everyday objects rather than elaborate ritual goods, though this could mean either that such goods were not appropriate for burial or simply that they were too valuable to bury. The occasional animal bones might represent final feasting, meals shared during the closure ceremonies, or they might be residual material from earlier use phases that happened to be incorporated into the fill. One particularly intriguing aspect of the burial is that it was so effective. For more than 8,000 years, Göbekli Tepe lay hidden beneath its mound, unknown to the civilizations that rose and fell in the region, unmentioned in any written record, unsuspected even by archaeologists who surveyed the area for decades. The site endured through the rise of Mesopotamian city-states, the empires of Assyria and Babylon, the conquests of Alexander, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine era, the Islamic caliphates, the Ottoman Empire, and into the modern nation-state period, all without being disturbed. This remarkable preservation was the unintended gift of the people who buried the site, their final act ensuring that their creation would survive to be discovered and wondered at by people living in a world they could not have imagined. The emotional dimension of the burial cannot be ignored. If Göbekli Tepe was as important as the evidence suggests, then the decision to close and bury it must have been profound and perhaps painful. Imagine being part of the final generation to use the site, knowing that you are ending a tradition that stretched back through your grandparents' time, through countless generations before. The stone pillars that had witnessed your ancestors' ceremonies, that embodied their beliefs and stories, would be covered over, hidden from view, their faces turned toward the earth rather than the sky. There might have been sadness in this, a sense of loss, but there might also have been a sense of completion, of having honored the old ways properly, of having given them a fitting end. We cannot know what those final participants felt, but we can recognize the burial as a significant act, one that shaped the site's destiny as profoundly as its initial construction. What does Göbekli Tepe tell us about humanity? What can we learn from these ancient stones about who we are and who we have always been? The implications of this site extend far beyond the specific historical details of when it was built and by whom. Göbekli Tepe forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature, about the trajectory of civilization, about the relationship between material conditions and cultural expression. For much of the modern era, the dominant narrative about human development was essentially economic determinism, the idea that material conditions, subsistence strategies, technologies of production, drive and determine social and cultural forms. In this view, hunter-gatherers were supposed to be primarily concerned with survival, with finding enough food, with the immediate practical challenges of existence. Art and religion and monumental architecture were luxuries that could only emerge once agriculture had created surpluses, freeing some people from the constant search for food. Göbekli Tepe demolishes this narrative. Here were hunter-gatherers creating sophisticated art and monumental architecture, investing thousands of hours of labor in projects that had no obvious practical survival value. The stone circles did not increase the food supply. They did not provide shelter from weather or enemies. They did not store grain or preserve meat. They were, in the most fundamental sense, impractical creations driven by beliefs and values rather than economic necessity. This tells us something profound. It tells us that humans have always been more than mere survival machines. We have always been meaning makers, symbol users, creatures driven by the need to understand our place in the cosmos, to connect with something beyond ourselves, to create beauty and endure through what we make. The sophistication of the art at Göbekli Tepe challenges another assumption, the notion of linear cultural progress, the idea that human societies move from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced, in a steady ascending trajectory. The quality of the carved animals at Göbekli Tepe equals or exceeds much later work. The compositional sense, the understanding of anatomy and motion, the confident execution, all speak to artistic traditions that were already mature 11,000 years ago. These were not people fumbling toward art. They were accomplished artists working within established traditions. This reminds us that cultural sophistication is not the same as technological advancement. A society can create profound art, complex social structures, and rich spiritual life without metal tools or written language or cities. The absence of these things does not indicate poverty of mind or spirit. Göbekli Tepe also reveals the capacity for large-scale cooperation among people without formal hierarchy or centralized authority. The construction of the site required hundreds of people working together, coordinating their efforts, contributing to a project that would take generations to complete. Yet there is no evidence at Göbekli Tepe of palaces or royal tombs, no burials with lavish grave goods indicating kings or chiefs, no defensive fortifications suggesting a warrior class extracting labor from subordinates. The cooperation appears to have been voluntary, motivated by shared belief and collective purpose rather than by coercion. This is important. It demonstrates that humans are capable of organizing complex projects without authoritarianism, that hierarchy and inequality are not inevitable prerequisites for monumental architecture or social complexity. The site speaks to the antiquity of religious consciousness, the deep human impulse toward the sacred. Whether we interpret the enclosures as temples or gathering places or some combination, they clearly served religious or ceremonial functions. The people who built Göbekli Tepe believed in something beyond the material world, in powers or beings that required acknowledgement and propitiation, in the importance of ritual action and symbolic expression. This religious sensibility is not a late development, an invention of settled agricultural societies, but an ancient, perhaps universal aspect of human cognition and culture. We are, and have always been, Homo religious, the religious animal, driven to seek meaning beyond mere survival, to ask questions about origin and destiny, to connect our individual lives to larger patterns and purposes. The question of whether Göbekli Tepe influenced the development of agriculture, whether the temple came before the village, remains open. But even asking this question represents a fundamental shift in how we think about cultural evolution. It acknowledges that ideas and beliefs can be historical forces, that religion and ritual are not merely reflections of economic arrangements, but can actively shape the development of subsistence strategies and social structures. This is a more complex and arguably more accurate view of how human societies change over time, recognizing the interplay of material conditions, social organization, and cultural beliefs in a dynamic system where cause and effect are not always simple or unidirectional. Göbekli Tepe also serves as a reminder of how much we have lost, how many layers of human history remain unknown or only partially understood. The site dates to a period with no written records, no texts to tell us what the builders believed, what stories they told, what names they gave to the carved beings on the pillars. We must interpret through the material remains alone, and much has perished. The wood and fiber and hide that would have been essential parts of the ceremonies, the songs and prayers and myths that gave meaning to the stone. We see the enduring skeleton but not the living flesh of Göbekli Tepe's ritual life. This should cultivate humility in our interpretations and wonder at what might lie undiscovered beneath other unremarkable hills across the ancient world. The preservation of Göbekli Tepe, both through its ancient burial and through modern excavation and conservation, is a gift. It allows us to glimpse a moment in human history that would otherwise be entirely lost, to stand where our ancestors stood 11,000 years ago, to trace our fingers along carvings made by hands anatomically identical to our own, but living in a world almost unimaginably different from ours. This connection across time is profound. It reminds us that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not aliens or primitives but human beings like us, with the same fundamental capacities for thought and feeling and creativity. The technologies they possessed were different, their knowledge of the world was structured differently, but their humanity was identical to ours. What Göbekli Tepe ultimately reveals is the depth of human potential, the capacity present in our species from very early times for abstract thought, artistic expression, social cooperation, and spiritual seeking. These capacities were not created by agriculture or cities or writing. They were already there, part of what it means to be human, expressed in different forms across different times and places but fundamentally constant. The hunter-gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe possessed the same cognitive toolkit, the same emotional range, the same creative drives as modern humans. They used these capacities to create something extraordinary, a monument that endures as testament to their vision and skill and dedication. In contemplating their achievement, we see not just the past but a mirror reflecting essential aspects of our own nature, the parts of us that create and believe and build for reasons that transcend mere survival. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not finished. The site continues to yield discoveries and much remains unknown, waiting beneath the earth for future excavations and future technologies to reveal. Current estimates suggest that only about 5% of the site has been excavated so far. The visible enclosures, impressive as they are, represent a small fraction of what lies buried. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have detected numerous additional structures beneath the surface, suggesting that Göbekli Tepe is far larger and more complex than even the spectacular excavated portions indicate. There might be dozens more enclosures waiting to be uncovered, each with its own unique configuration of pillars and carvings, each potentially revealing new information about the beliefs and practices of the builders. The decision to proceed slowly with excavation is deliberate. Modern archaeology has learned painful lessons from earlier periods when sites were excavated rapidly, with inadequate recording, destroying context and losing information that could never be recovered. At Göbekli Tepe, each season of excavation is carefully planned and meticulously documented. Every artifact is catalogued, every layer of soil analyzed, every stone photographed and measured. Advanced technologies are employed. Three-dimensional laser scanning to create precise digital models of the structures, chemical analysis of residues to identify what substances might have been used in rituals, DNA analysis of animal bones to understand species composition and hunting patterns. This careful scientific approach ensures that maximum information is extracted from each excavated context, building a detailed picture of the site's construction, use, and abandonment. Ongoing research continues to refine our understanding. New dating techniques are being applied to organic materials from different contexts, providing a more precise chronology of the site's development. Comparative studies with other Neolithic sites in the region are revealing patterns and connections, showing that Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader cultural horizon, sharing certain traits with contemporary sites while also having unique characteristics. Analysis of the flint tools found at the site, including determination of their source through chemical fingerprinting, is mapping trade networks and movement patterns, showing how far people traveled to participate in the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe. The enclosures currently visible to visitors represent primarily the oldest layer, Layer 3, with its large pillars and elaborate carvings. Later layers designated Layer 2 and Layer Ys show changes over time. The enclosures become smaller, the pillars less massive, the carvings sometimes less elaborate. Whether this represents a decline in capability, or a shift in priorities, or simply different stylistic choices, is debated. Some researchers suggest that as agriculture took hold and people settled into permanent villages, the resources and motivation for massive communal projects might have diminished. Others argue that the later builders were making different kinds of statements, that smaller and more numerous enclosures might indicate a shift from regional centers serving many communities to more localized ritual spaces serving specific groups. The question of who built Göbekli Tepe, in the sense of which specific cultural or ethnic groups were responsible, remains difficult to answer. The pre-pottery Neolithic populations of this region left no written records, no names for themselves. We categorize them by their archaeological characteristics, their tool types and settlement patterns and architectural styles, but we cannot know what languages they spoke or how they identified themselves. Genetic studies of ancient DNA from human remains found at Neolithic sites in the region are beginning to reveal population movements and relationships, showing connections between early farming populations in Anatolia and later populations in Europe and other regions. But the specific builders of Göbekli Tepe remain anonymous, known to us only through their work. The impact of Göbekli Tepe on our understanding of human history continues to ripple through academic disciplines. Archaeologists studying other sites are looking with fresh eyes at structures previously interpreted as utilitarian, wondering if they might have had ceremonial functions. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies are paying more attention to ritual and symbolic life, recognizing that these are not peripheral activities but central to human social organization. Historians of religion are reconsidering the origins and development of religious consciousness. The idea that monumental sacred architecture might predate and possibly catalyze agricultural development has opened new lines of inquiry and debate. The site has also captured public imagination. Göbekli Tepe has been featured in documentaries and popular books, attracting visitors from around the world who come to see the ancient pillars and to contemplate what they represent. This public interest is valuable. It demonstrates that the distant past is not irrelevant but fascinating, that understanding where we came from and how we got here is a deeply human concern. The site has become a point of pride for Turkey, recognized as part of the world's shared heritage. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, an acknowledgement of its outstanding universal value, its importance to all humanity regardless of nationality or culture. Conservation of the site is an ongoing challenge. Exposure to the elements, even with the protective shelter, causes gradual weathering of the limestone. Visitor traffic, while carefully managed, still poses risks to fragile surfaces. Conservators work continuously to monitor the condition of the pillars and enclosure walls, to stabilize areas at risk of deterioration, to balance the need for public access with the imperative to preserve the site for future generations. Advanced materials are used to consolidate fragile stone while ensuring that all interventions are reversible, that future conservators with better technologies can undo what is done today if necessary. This conservative approach, the same philosophy that guides the slow pace of excavation, reflects an understanding that we are merely temporary custodians of this heritage, responsible for passing it on intact to those who come after us. The academic debates about Göbekli Tepe will continue. New discoveries will prompt new interpretations. Technologies not yet invented will reveal information we cannot currently access. Future excavations might find the burials we have not yet seen, might uncover artifacts that clarify obscure aspects of symbolism and practice, or perhaps some mysteries will remain permanently unsolved, the full meaning of the site lost with the people who created it, knowable only in fragments and through informed speculation. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is an inherent aspect of studying the deep past, a reminder that our knowledge is always partial, always subject to revision, always approximate rather than absolute. What we can say with confidence is that Göbekli Tepe has fundamentally altered our understanding of the human story. The neat narrative of agriculture leading to civilization has been complicated, enriched, made more nuanced and more interesting. We now recognize that the path from hunting and gathering to settled agricultural life was not straight or simple, that it involved experimentation and choice, belief and ritual, that it was driven not just by material necessity but by social and spiritual motivations. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were agents in their own history, actively creating new possibilities, not passive recipients of environmental or economic forces. This more complex view of the past gives us a more complex view of ourselves, recognizing human agency, creativity, and the power of ideas to shape the material world. The stones stand patient on their Turkish hillside, mostly still buried, waiting. They have waited 11,000 years. They can wait longer. They are the gift of our ancestors, a message in stone that we are still learning to read, a testament to the depth of human capacity for vision and creation. As long as we continue to approach them with respect, with curiosity, with the humility to admit what we do not know while celebrating what we can discover, they will continue to teach us. They will continue to connect us across the vast gulf of time to people who were in all essential ways ourselves. The temple stands in the ancient hills, the first temple perhaps, certainly among the oldest, and in its endurance, it whispers to us of continuity, of the long arc of human becoming, of the eternal questions that have always drawn us to create sacred spaces and to gather together seeking answers. And so our journey to Göbekli Tepe comes to its close. We have traveled back 11,600 years to stand among stones carved by hands like ours, to witness the dawn of monumental sacred architecture, to glimpse a moment when humanity stood at a threshold, looking forward into a future that would bring agriculture and cities and all the complexity of civilization, yet still deeply rooted in the ancient ways of the hunter-gatherer, the wanderer, the one who lives with the land rather than attempting to dominate it. We have seen how these people, without metal or writing or wheels, created something of breathtaking sophistication and beauty, investing their labor and creativity in structures that served no survival function but fulfilled deeper needs, the need for meaning, for connection, for the sacred. We have examined the pillars themselves, those T-shaped monoliths with their carved menageries of lions and boars, foxes and snakes, vultures and scorpions, creatures of power and danger rendered with artistic skill that commands respect across the millennia. We have considered the engineering knowledge required to quarry and move and erect these multi-ton stones using only stone tools and human muscle and clever application of leverage. We have imagined the gatherings, hundreds of people coming together from scattered bands, feasting on gazelle and wild cattle, participating in ceremonies whose specific forms we can only guess but whose importance is written in the stone itself. We have pondered the meaning of it all, the possible astronomical alignments, the potential funerary practices, the role of the site as regional ceremonial center binding together diverse communities in shared ritual and belief. We have placed Göbekli Tepe in its broader context, understanding it as part of the Neolithic transition, that slow and complex shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled life. We have explored the radical possibility that the temple came before the village, that religious gathering might have driven rather than followed from agricultural development. We have seen how this one site challenges fundamental assumptions about human nature and cultural evolution, demonstrating that meaning-making and artistic expression and monumental construction are not luxuries available only to societies with agricultural surpluses, but are core aspects of human nature present from very early times. We have witnessed the deliberate burial of the site, that careful and systematic concealment that preserved these structures through 8,000 years of historical change, empires rising and falling above while below the stones waited silent in their earthen tomb. And we have considered what Göbekli Tepe teaches us about ourselves, about the continuity of human consciousness across vast spans of time, about the shared capacity for abstract thought and symbolic expression and religious seeking that connects us to people who lived in a world vastly different from ours, yet who were fundamentally the same as us in all the ways that matter most. The stones are a mirror. When we look at them, when we contemplate what they represent, we see not just the ancient past but essential aspects of our own nature, the parts of us that create for reasons beyond necessity, that seek connection with something larger than ourselves, that build for the future, even knowing we will not live to see the completion of what we begin. The physical site of Göbekli Tepe stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage location, protected and studied, visited by thousands of people each year who come to marvel at what our ancestors achieved. The modern shelter, that sweeping curved structure of wood and fabric, protects the excavated areas from rain and sun and wind. Walkways allow visitors to look down into the stone circles, to see the pillars still standing after more than 11 millennia, to trace with their eyes the carved reliefs that remain crisp and clear despite the passage of ages. The experience of visiting Göbekli Tepe is profound. To stand in that place knowing what it is, when it was built, by whom, is to feel the weight of time and the lightness of human spirit simultaneously. The stones are old beyond imagining, yet the impulse that created them, the need for beauty and meaning and connection, is immediately recognizable, present and alive in us still. Most of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated, protected beneath the mound that has preserved it so well for so long. Future archaeologists, equipped with technologies we cannot yet imagine, will continue the work of revelation, slowly and carefully, uncovering more of this extraordinary site. Each new discovery will add to our understanding, will answer some questions while raising others, will deepen our appreciation for the sophistication and complexity of these earliest builders of monumental sacred space. But even with all the discoveries yet to come, the essential wonder will remain. These people, 11,600 years ago, living as hunter-gatherers in a world just emerging from the Ice Age, created something of such ambition and artistry that it still has the power to move us, to challenge our assumptions, to expand our understanding of what humans have always been capable of achieving. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe extends far beyond the stones themselves. It lives in the revised narratives of human history now being taught, in the new questions being asked by researchers, in the broadened perspective we have gained on the relationship between material conditions and cultural expression. It lives in every person who has stood before those ancient pillars and felt the connection across time, the recognition of shared humanity with the anonymous builders whose names we will never know but whose work endures. It lives in the ongoing care and study of the site, in the commitment to preserve it for future generations, in the slow and patient work of excavation and conservation that continues season after season. As we leave Göbekli Tepe, as we return from 11,000 years ago to our own time, we carry with us the knowledge of what we have seen. We understand now that the origins of civilization are more complex than we previously thought, that the temple truly might have come before the village, that religion and ritual and the creation of sacred space are not late developments but ancient aspects of human nature. We recognize that our ancestors were not lesser versions of ourselves struggling toward capabilities we now possess, but fully human, as intelligent and creative and spiritually aware as we are, expressing those qualities in ways appropriate to their time and place. We see in their achievement both the particularity of that moment, that specific cultural and environmental context, and the universality of the impulses that drove them, impulses we still feel and act upon today. The modern world moves at a pace unimaginable to the people who built Göbekli Tepe. We live surrounded by technologies they could not have conceived, in social structures of complexity they never experienced, with access to knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of written record. Yet in fundamental ways, we remain the same. We still seek meaning. We still create beauty. We still gather together to acknowledge forces larger than ourselves. We still build structures meant to endure, to outlast our individual lives, to speak to future generations of what we valued and believed. Göbekli Tepe reminds us of this continuity, grounds us in the deep time of human becoming, connects us to the long chain of generations stretching back to the very dawn of monumental sacred architecture. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the first temple on Earth. Our story of Göbekli Tepe fades now, but the stones remain, patient and enduring, waiting beneath the Turkish sun for the next visitor, the next question, the next moment of connection across time. The ancient builders have left us their gift. We honor it by seeking to understand it, by preserving it with care, by allowing it to expand our sense of what is possible and what has always been true about our species. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you rest and peace, sleep well, and dream of distant ages, of stone circles under ancient stars, of gatherings in sacred space where our ancestors danced and feasted and connected with the eternal. The archive of history is now closed. Good night.